Everybody here, we should all quit our day jobs and just study this stuff forever.
Hello, my name is Ria Windcaller, and I am the producer and cider MC of this weekly podcast, where we speak with makers, cider enthusiasts, and folks within the cider trade from around the world.
Hip, hip, hooray!
That was John Bunker bringing us into this here episode, encouraging us all to quit our day jobs and study apples. Sign us up, right? Everybody's raising their hands out there in Ciderville, and a lot of folks are already doing that. I bring these conversations to you each and every week. We are now in Season 8 of Cider Chat. There are over 350 episodes in the archives. You could find them on all the different podcast app directories out there, or by going to ciderchat.com and check out the podcast page. Each season is laid out 1 through 8. There's photos of the featured guest or the conversations that happen. And there's show notes for each of those episodes with links to, key mentions during the episode and, of course, the featured guests. And this week it is John Bunker. We're hearing the Q&A from his talk at Maine Apple Camp. He was speaking last week in episode 352. You could hear the full presentation, all on both the successes and challenges at the Maine Heritage Orchard, which is just quite a story because they chose to do this heritage orchard, as they call it, in an abandoned gravel pit, which is quite an undertaking. And of course, there were some good things about that and some challenges. So he speaks all about that, but also brings us into a bit of his history coming into Maine at the age of 21, how he started his really lifelong career of being an apple explorer, a historian, a researcher. He's also a author on the topic, the founder of FEDCO Trees. Anytime I get to record some of his audio, I'm there. I'm there because I think it's just something that we want to have going forward. He has so much research, so much insight over that long span of time that he's been doing that. He's now in his 70s. He started doing this when he was like 21 years old, moving to Maine. So that's, 50 plus years of apple research. And as such, you really get to, build your storyline and have that long view, which is so precious, absolutely precious. It saves a lot of folks just starting to get into this area of discovery with apples and research. And of course, now there's DNA research with apples. It gives everyone a certain vantage point that we would not otherwise have if John hadn't put in all that time early on. And so it's quite remarkable. So definitely go back to last week's episode if you haven't already listened to it. And this is going to be a follow-up with the Q&A because there's little pearls of wisdom in each answer that he gives. I think you'll find it really rewarding. So we'll be going to that a little bit later on in this episode. But first, I have some letters from patrons of Cider Chat and also from our sponsors. So let's roll to that next. Bent Ladder Cider and Wine is based in Doylestown, Ohio. And they are now patrons of Cider Chat. So I'm super excited about that because it allowed me to get to meet somebody I didn't know in the cider community, which there's a lot of you out there listening that I don't quite yet know, haven't met in person, but I'm looking forward to raising that glass. And one of those folks is Matt. Matt and his brother started Bent Ladder Cider and Wine. So I asked Matt some questions, a little bit about finding this podcast and whatnot, and his journey. And this is what he wrote. My brother Chris, who runs the orchard end of our operation, is a devout podcast listener. He is also an avid researcher who is always trying to learn new things. A couple years ago, he somehow came across Cider Chat when he was researching cider apple varieties to plant in our orchard. He listened to a couple episodes and immediately recommended it to me. We have both found the podcast enjoyable and informative. It is approachable for the layperson, but still offers valuable insights for commercial growers and cider makers like us. Wonderful. That's exactly the target audience. You got to have a little bit for everything. So thanks for that input. I asked him a little bit about his journey with cider, and he wrote, I don't have what you would call a traditional background in cider making. I was raised on fruit farms both in Northeast Ohio and the Yakima Valley of Washington. Fruit growing and cider making was not on my radar for a career, though. My parents retired down to the Tennessee mountains, where I went to college for photography and photojournalism. At some point, my dad, always the orchardist, got tired of retirement and wanted another property to start a retirement hobby farm. He settled on a rundown 125-acre farm about an hour south of Cleveland, Ohio. My brother was pursuing a doctorate at Case Western Reserve at the time, but was quickly becoming disenchanted with spending his life in a basement. Ooh, I could get that. He started helping our dad plant trees and renovate the land, and then it all kind of ballooned from there. It quickly became apparent that it was a bigger undertaking than anyone had planned for. I transferred to Kent State, which was only about 40 minutes from the farm, to help them out. After graduating, I went to work on the farm full-time. As I'm sure you know, farming is hard, not really that profitable. We knew to support multiple families, we would have to develop a value-added product. Luckily for me, I grew up around some really fantastic wineries and vineyard sites, so I've always loved wine. I thought it would be a good idea to eventually build a winery. So my brother and I started to research what can be grown in our location and reached out to the Ohio State Extension Service. Now that was a brilliant move, and every state has an extension service, typically through the state university, so good move. He continues with, we knew we wanted to be an estate operation, so we had to get ahead with growing fruit. We planted our first grapes in 2008. I then turned my attention to studying how to turn fruit juice into a palpable drink. I bought every textbook and manual I could find and started reading and rereading them until I started to understand them. At the same time, the craft cider boom started to take shape. There was literally no one in Ohio that was making cider at the time. I quickly realized that we were sitting on a golden opportunity. Though we had about 5 acres of grapes, we had closer to 50 acres of apples. One of the cooler things we had done was plant a lot of heirloom apple varieties like Golden Russet, Roxbury Russet, Baldwin, etc. I found out that these apples made some pretty good ciders, too. They sure do. So I revised my plan, and when I moved forward with designing the facility, I made sure I could accommodate both wine and cider production. The rest is history. We opened our doors in 2016 as the first estate craft cidery in the state since Prohibition, and one of the very first farm wineries in Ohio under a new permit designation recognizing estate operations. Cider sales quickly outpaced wines. My brother and I started planting a hard cider-specific orchard and a test orchard to trial new and developing varieties. We have been able to launch a Heritage Series lines of ciders using these orchards to highlight the fruit, our terroir, and the traditional cider characteristics that can come with high-quality craft production. He writes also, I really enjoy full-bodied, dry traditional ciders made from heirloom apples. One of my passions is using old world apples and modern techniques to really push the potential of the fruit to the max. I enjoy being able to taste the care and craft that went into growing the fruit and making the cider. You could hide a lot of things with sugar and other additives, so I gravitate towards a more pure expression of the fruit. Nice letter, Matt. Thank you so much. It was so informative. I'm always impressed by the letters that I get written to me, which is why I love sharing them on the podcast. I mean, now we know a bit about this cidery in Ohio. It's a little south of Cleveland, as he wrote. So a little bit outside of Akron, Ohio, too, is another way to place it geography-wise. And thank you so much for becoming patrons of Cider Chat. There is an online shop, so if you're listening to this letter that Matt just wrote and you're thinking, damn, those ciders, they sound good, you could get some of their cider by just shopping online. All you have to do is go to bentladder.com. I'm not sure about the bent ladder, like how that came about. We'll have to talk to Matt about that following up. If you hear this, Matt, drop me a line and let me know how you got the name Bent Ladder, because that's a little terrifying when you think about going up on an apple tree. I need an apple ladder. I have to go do some pruning. It is pruning season out there right now. This podcast is going live in January, and people are starting to go out and trim back the trees, and you don't want a bent ladder up there. I might drinking a bent ladder cider, though. That would go good out in the orchard right now. I can tell you that. Yeah, so check it out. And if you, like Matt and Chris, enjoyed this podcast and you want to support it and keep it on the air, and if you're a commercial cidery, you, like Bent Ladder, can become part of the Cider Going Up campaign. There's a dedicated page at ciderchat.com for all the folks who are joining that specific campaign. It costs about 2 bottles of cider per month to support this podcast so I could keep on releasing these episodes. Just Google Cider Chat and Patreon. It's spelled Patreon, and join at any level that makes it doable for you.
Walking through the orchard.
Coming up in 1 week's time is CiderCon, which is the annual conference that is hosted by the American Cider Association, and it's going to be kicking off on January 31st with tours throughout Chicago. That's the main location where we're all headed to next week. I'll be going on the tours on Tuesday. Can't wait to see everybody then. And then on February 1st through the 3rd is the main part of the event, where there's a whole bunch of different workshops, tasting panels, cider shares, and a lot of networking, and a trade show with a lot of vendors that have equipment. So it's a great opportunity, whether you are a cider enthusiast, or you're someone who is looking to get into commercial making, or you're full on into it now. This is the place where you can kind of speak to your peers, talk about what's going on. Some of the late night conversations that take place at the hotel bar is a ton of fun. You know that you will find me there late night, chit-chatting away and seeing friends and making new friends. And of course, raising a glass. So don't be shy in saying, hey, Rhea, what you doing? Let's have a cider. I would really enjoy that if you get a moment to say hi my way. I want to give you a couple little tips here. I have done past episodes about going to CiderCon. I don't have that full piece now, but I want to give you some things to consider. Most folks are flying into O'Hare Airport, which is outside of the city. It's probably like a 30-minute drive if the traffic is good going into Chicago. Next week, I'm looking at the temperatures for that time while we're there, and we're looking at the highest temp being around 20 degrees. It's going to be cold. It's going to be really cold, so dress accordingly. Most folks are going to be flying in to Chicago area, and you'll be landing at O'Hare International Airport. Here's a little cool piece of tidbit for you. ORD, which is the call letters for the airport, that stands for orchard. So at one time, you're going to be landing in what was apple orchards. So goes progress. Kind of cool, also kind of sad, but it's just the way it goes. You gotta roll with it, folks. Getting from the airport, you do have the option to take a taxi or get some kind of like little lift. You could do that. There's also public transportation, which is pretty good too. It takes about an hour to do that, and it's super easy. Like, take the Blue Line. I kind of recommend taking the Blue Line to the Harold Washington Library stop. It's about a half a mile walk from there to the Hilton, and it's not that bad. Like, you're in the city, so it's kind of nice if you're like me and you've been, I'll be up really early that morning traveling and trying to get there. And I believe that there is an elevator that will lift you up if you have luggage onto street level. I have stopped at the Harrison Metro, and there is no lift, and it's really tough with luggage and kind of slippery on the steps there, and, just something to think about. It's also a big price difference. It costs you like, I don't know, $5, maybe $6 to take the Metro versus like a $40 plus, or $50 taxi ride. So it's up to you what you're down for. I love doing public transportation as I can because I want to support it, and I also like to get landed, and no better way to do that than to get out of the airport and be in the city. With that said, dress warmly. It looks like it's going to be like 20 degrees in Chicago. Remember, it's called the Windy City, so the wind chill can really even bring it down lower. But we'll have warm hearts and full cups at CiderCon, so I don't think it's going to be a problem at all. There is just so much fun ahead. Chicago Cider Week is happening that whole week. There's events every single night, so definitely check out Chicago Cider Week website. I'll have a link to that in the show notes. CiderCon takes place January 31st through February 3rd. I'm going to be leading a panel discussion with Elizabeth Ryan, Dan Pucci, and Gregory Peck. Elizabeth is the owner of Hudson Valley Farmhouse Cider. Dan Pucci is the author of American Cider, and Gregory Peck is the head of the Department of Pomology at Cornell University. And we'll be discussing New York terroir and apples. There's going to be 5 ciders during that tasting from some incredible cideries in New York. We're going to be looking at single varietal ciders, Northern Spy, Newtown Pippin, and Spitzenberg. So that Spitzenberg is from Elizabeth's Cidery, and I just adore her. That's just going to be an incredible panel. It's like one of the last sessions at CiderCon. Then the next day, on February 4th, is Chicago Cider Summit. It's just like you could see the location from the hotel. It's at what is called the Navy Pier, and they have 2 session tastings there. Now, I know you listening right now, maybe you're going to be able to attend that or maybe not. If you cannot attend Cider Summit, I have you covered because I'm going to be doing a video live stream at Cider Summit, 2 different times. And remember, this is Central Time, so make sure that you coordinate it as such. So it'll be 1 to 2 p.m., and we have a list of different people that are going to be coming by. The first thing we're going to be kicking off is the showcasing the final trials for those folks who are practicing earlier, or I should say competing earlier, at the Eris Cidery and Brewery. They're having a competition for like the high pour with Cider. You know, this is what you do in Spain, in Asturias, where you hold the bottle high over your head and you pour down into a glass that's held right in front of you. You can't look at the glass. You're not supposed to. People do peek out, so maybe they'll be getting judged for that. We're going to be live streaming that and then going to different interviews with different folks, all at Cider Summit. So that's from 1 to 2. Later on that day, from 5:30 to 6:30, we'll have a whole new bevy of other folks coming by. So do subscribe now to the Cider Chat YouTube channel so you get notified when that goes live. And it will, in case there's nothing embarrassing that I do, it will be staying up there at the Cider Chat YouTube channel. Oh, my goodness. You know when they say you have a face for radio, that's a little how I feel. So doing the video is like, oh, my goodness, I don't know. It's going to be interesting. Anything could happen. But I plan on keeping it up there, even if I have to take it down and edit it a little bit. It'll be live at Cider Chat YouTube channel. Please subscribe. Okay, so that's what's happening next week. And also I want to say next week's episode will be also from Maine Apple Camp, and that's going to be talking about historical varieties of apples. I mean, wow, what a cast of characters we have on that. It's just incredible discussion. So do make sure that maybe you can listen to it while you're on your way to CiderCon. Oh, one more thing about the trade fair at CiderCon. One of the big sponsors for Cider Chat is Fermentis, and they create yeast cultures for cider makers. They have 4 different styles, and they're going to be at the trade fair there in the hotel, and they'll be at booth 413 to talk to you about yeast. So that's a great opportunity. Let them know Cider Chat sent you, and I'm going to be going out to dinner with the Fermentis team next week. I cannot wait to hang out with them, and I'll be talking to them about yeast, of course. I'm really excited. They've been so supportive of Cider Chat, which should tell you a lot about where their intention is. They get what this podcast is doing for cider, and as such, I get what they want to do for cider in turn. So check them out at booth 413 at CiderCon.
Ria, it's Adam Levy, the alcohol professor. Good to talk to you.
Hi, Adam. Thanks, as always, for sponsoring Cider Chat. I'm really excited to be able to let people know that the New York International Cider Competition is coming up on February 18th. And this is the time to be sending in ciders for that competition. which is judged by trade buyers, folks who could give direct input on what consumers will do in terms of price point and whether or not it's worth their time to put it on the shelves, because as we know, shelf space is really, really limited. So I was wondering what makes it worth for them if they actually win a medal in the New York International Cider Competition.
What's really exciting for producers, and they really get excited when this happens, is when we start showcasing the winners on our site, the Alcohol Professor and the Cheese Professor. We get around 70,000 plus unique hits per month on each site. We're starting to do more pairing articles also. So we're starting pairing, ciders and cheeses and other products, which is great. We like to try to start doing like almost travel pieces. Like if you're visiting the Hudson Valley, here's 5 cider producers to visit, and here's some interesting cheeses to taste from other cheese creameries up in that area. And we want to start doing more of these type of pieces, even in Texas and California and other areas in the country. We strongly believe in doing cross-pollination. So we basically include the Alcohol Professor and the Cheese Professor with our results. And that's where we showcase the winners. And we're very excited with the content we have. So please definitely check out alcoholprofessor.com and cheeseprofessor.com. And our growing new site, The Chocolate Professor. So things I want to consume. I'm not doing asparagus. I'm doing beer, wine, spirits, cheese, and chocolate. So I'm enjoying my life. Hope you can join me also.
I am there, Adam, 100%. Oh, my goodness. You got me at chocolate. Never mind cider. I'm only kidding. Anywho, the New York International Cider Competition is taking place February 18th. Make sure to use promo code CHAT23 for $10 off your entry. Go to nyicidercompetition.com. Up next is our Q&A with John Bunker from Maine Apple Camp. You're going to be hearing, folks are out in the audience. They didn't really have a microphone, and so bear with it. I kind of edit it as such where it kind of rolls into one answer after another. And this is your opportunity to just kind of settle back and hear the wisdom from this man who has like 50 plus years all on apples, and specifically helping people discover apples in their own backyard and bringing these historic apples to a place where they can be saved and preserved for lifetimes to come. So there's a lot to be said about that in and of itself, and you'll be hearing more in next week's episode on historical varieties and preserving them. But meanwhile, enjoy this Q&A with John Bunker, which followed his feature presentation in episode 352 on the Maine Heritage Orchard, successes and challenges over the past 10 years.
Between the time that you started reclaiming the gravel pit and started doing soil improvements, what was like your timeline? You started before you actually had trees in the ground.
It was really only a year. Had I been 20 instead of, 60, I'm now 70. Like, let's say you were going to do one of these, and you had a pit, So what I would say is find some good land, store your collection there, so to speak. Start your library of apples there, maybe even on dwarfs that are set 5 feet apart or whatever. And then start renovating your depleted land, whether it's land that has been clear cut or a gravel pit or a parking lot or whatever. And then as you improve it, which could be several years, then start to move your collection into it, maybe even on standards at that point, so you have a more long-lived tree or whatever. I mean, we've learned a lot about this pit, and I feel like it wasn't, I don't think we failed because we are improving the pit. But I think that that the preservation and the restoration are kind of two different projects. And I think now we need to at least make sure that we don't lose the most important of our material because of the challenges of the pit. One of the strategies that people use for renovating disturbed land is to buy lots of topsoil and bring it in and put it there. Well, now what you're doing is you're like robbing Peter to pay Paul, so you're like stripping somebody else's land so that you have it. And that was one of the things that we emphatically refused to do, because that would be like totally defeating everything that we were trying to accomplish. Yeah.
So I'm here as a library science master's candidate, and so it's really fascinating to hear you talk about your work in the context of collection management. And to that end, I was curious, because you talked a little bit about the fact of the matter that when you share varieties with a customer or anyone, that it's sort of expanding the collection and helping with the preservation effort. When you send out grafting wood or the like, do you have any sort of terms or conditions for folks knowing that there are some varieties for which their trees may have to rebuild the collection, or are you just sort of casting fate to the wind?
The way that that our stewardship program works, and we do that through FEDCO. So in the FEDCO catalog, there's a page that says, join our stewardship program. So in that case, we do keep, obviously we keep track of the people and where they live and everything. It's a little bit, so you buy a plant from us and you don't know anything about MAFCA or, whatever, you're just buying a tree. And for us to keep track of you and then to contact you can be a little creepy for some people. And this was like a partnership between the business community, i.e. FEDCO, and the nonprofit community, MAFCA. I think that what I would do, and I don't write the catalog anymore, but what I would do, which is sort of speaks to what you're saying, is as I would say at the beginning of the apple, section or whatever, these starred varieties are very rare. If you buy them, we'd like to know who you are or something like that. Be in touch with, somehow give it to them so that they can do that. We have occasionally tried to track down who bought something that was just lost and we were frantic, but for the most part, we kind of stay away from that. So
just to bring it back a bit to the restoration of the gravel pit. So I'm really interested in the field of land arts and earthworks, and I was grateful to be able to visit it yesterday, and it immediately struck me as really similar to a lot of land arts projects I've seen that focus on bioremediation and restoration. And I know, of course, preserving these apples is the first priority, but I was wondering if there were elements of land arts practices people were thinking about, that you were thinking about going into this, or just even the way that these things kind of tie into arts and culture, because that's something I'm really interested in the world of apples, is kind of the storytelling and arts element of them, because there is, I think, a long tradition of art being made and stories being told of these apples. So I was just curious.
Well, I don't think we did that consciously, but I, my own personal belief, the landscape in which you live, whether it's a quarter of an acre or 1,000 acres or anything in between, should be, I hate to use the word should, but anyway, we'll say should be beautiful. And it is art. And I do personally think a lot about the manufactured landscape, which is what, in a sense, that's what this is right here. This is carved out of a natural landscape, but it has become a manufactured landscape, or whatever you want to call it, contrived, manufactured, partnership, whatever. And I think that is in part like the actual earthwork, because you saw, I mean, it was, Todd is right. I mean, it just looked completely trashed and looked nothing like it does now. I mean, we did major earthwork to it. And in a sense, we sort of created it into a sculpture. We sculptured those terraces, but I think that can also extend to the choice of plants and how you manage the plants. Do you mow? And if you mow, how much do you mow? And where do you mow? And when do you mow? And what plants do you... So part of it is what do you plant? What do you introduce? And part of it is what do you encourage that would be there anyway? I mean, I think it's all incredibly interesting, and I like the term land arts, and I had not heard it. And I think that inadvertently, or what's the opposite of inadvertently? Vertently? Inadvertently or vertently, that's what we do, whether we want to or not. And unfortunately, a lot of the time that we do it as humans, we do a less than stellar job or whatever, but we can't, in a way, we can't avoid doing it. And I think when we start to consciously do it, which is I think is what you're talking about, then it's incredibly fun and inviting and healing and I mean lots of different things.
Are you finding that like the northern Maine, the apples are very different in the southern Maine? I live at the very southern tip of Vermont, so for me that New Hampshire, Massachusetts border, there's other than the 1938 hurricane, there's really not much landscape difference.
Yeah, that's a good question. And so that leads to the in particular is important to identification work. This national group we're working in, we're trying to identify a finite number of regions in the country. We have 9 right now, and maybe it'll end up being 12 or whatever. And then what are the most common, like 20 or 30 or 40, whatever, cultivars, historic cultivars that you would find in that bioregion or whatever. So that's sort of like a more macro version of what you're talking about. In the state of Maine, or you could say in New England, because you're right, the borders are completely arbitrary, there are definitely, indisputably, in the case of apples, and probably in the case of many other plants as well, including native plants, including wild plants, but we'll talk about apples. What we're trying to do now, and these borders are arbitrary too, is by county, Maine has 16 counties. We're trying to say, okay, so if you find an apple in Piscataquis County or Androscoggin County or whatever, here are the apples that we know were historically grown in that area. If you find an apple that has no name because you know it's grafted because you've seen the graft line or whatever, it's in an old orchard or something. So you live in area X, those are the first ones to look at. That doesn't mean that it is going to be one of those, but we'll say 80% of the apples, old apples that you're going to find are probably going to be one of these 20 or 30 varieties or whatever. And one of the people who's going to speak tomorrow, who's here in the back row, Dan Newman, has been doing a lot of work with scouring old newspapers and looking for references of what was shown at the fair in town X or town Y. This is like from 19th century. So as an indication of building that list of what to look for when you go to, Waterville, Maine or Auburn, Maine or whatever. So absolutely yes. And of course, there's lots of overlap. And some varieties were grown in practically every county. Each one has its own subset of assortment. So absolutely. And that's going to be true in Vermont, in Mass, everywhere.
When you're discovering these, have you been hearing these stories of like, oh, it's this old woman who lived down the street and she had this beautiful apple tree that was loaded every year and we all would come collect apples. Is that
that's how, for all of them. In Dan Bussey's book, and Dan's here this weekend, and those of you that don't have Dan's book should get it. It's the multi-volume illustrated history. He has listed, 16, 17,000 apples, and there's a story like that behind every one of them, and this preservation thing we're going to do tomorrow is we're going to talk about that, and he's going to be part of that panel, I'm pretty sure, and where he's working a lot now is in genealogy, so which is like, some people would say, what does that have to do with apples? Well, it has a lot to do with apple history because also, another thing besides like, okay, so here's the story behind Pick an Apple, Northern Spy. Actually, there's a woman here that is a nurse, but she's been studying Northern Spy for like 10 years. That's sort of like what she does when she's not nursing is study Northern Spy. They all have this story. Part of the story is how did it get from there to there? We're finding through DNA work, we're finding apples in very different parts of the country that were historically grown. How did that happen? So then you get into like, okay, so they got in a wagon in 1850 because Maine they'd cut all the trees in Maine, which basically they did, and now they're moving to, wherever, Ohio or whatever. Who were these people? And another issue involved is we find, okay, so this variety here and this variety here through DNA are showing to be the same. Now, is one of them incorrectly identified, or are all these apples grown in different places and these are just synonyms of each other? So it's not like they had it wrong. It's just that's what it was called in, a great example is of one of the most famous of all American apples is the Newtown Pippin, which is called the Albemarle Pippin in Virginia. Now, who's right and who's wrong? Well, I don't think anybody's wrong. It's just, that's part of the whole thing. So genealogy becomes very important, and migration of people, which is of course related. A person that, if you're interested, any of you, there's a person named Isabella Dalla Regione in Italy, and she's been doing this stuff, and Cami and I went over and met her, which was just super fun. But what she has been able to do, she's been studying the apples and the other fruit in the frescoes of the monasteries and the estates and whatever. These are like permanent records because these were painted. What would happen is the painter would come to your, these were wealthy people, they'd come to your estate and they say, well, on the living room here, could you, so they use wet, it's wet plaster. So they say, well, what should we paint? Well, they go out to the garden and they get the apples off the trees and the pears and the grapes and whatever, and they bring them in and they paint them all. Well, there's a record of what was grown in that location at that time. And so she's been able to historically recreate migration patterns of varieties in Italy that no historians knew about because you can plot it. Well, here's there, and then here's this old road that those fruits or vegetables were traveling on. Everybody here, we should all quit our day jobs and just study this stuff forever. Okay, who else?
And I was just curious if you know of places like dumps or something that people are trying to use apples as reclamation project, and if there's been studies on the fruit and the edibility of the fruit.
I mean, I know that kind of, bioremediation, if you call it that, is really important. I haven't heard about them doing it with apples. I know that right now they're trying to do it with cannabis, and that I can't remember exactly. I'm not part of that research, but we know that there are plants that take up, contaminants, including PFAS. And then I guess the challenge is, what do you do with the plant material afterwards? And I also know that some plants, and I don't know about apples specifically, but I do know that some plants, it takes it up in certain parts of the plants and not in other parts of the plant. And I think that there is a huge amount of research going on around that right now, but I don't know about apples. I'm pretty sure the Mafta land was never orchards, and so it was never sprayed with lead arsenic. And I don't know if they've tested for PFAS. One of the people I was talking with here was talking about renovating an old farm down east someplace on the coast. And he was talking about the fact that the farm had been abandoned for a long time. And I think that one of the things that, especially if you're interested in buying land, buying farmland that has been abandoned is like a really great thing, as opposed to buying farmland that has been used recently, because unfortunately so much of it was contaminated. As I was saying, ours is, we're in the woods and we have no stone walls, so we know that it's probably not contaminated, although it was stripped. About 10 years ago, we bought some adjacent land that does have stone walls, and we have one of our orchards there, and it's contiguous with our property. But I'm pretty sure that it's not contaminated also, because it was just abandoned. And so I think that doesn't really answer your question, but I think if we're gonna buy land or use land, maybe we want the land that, grew up and nobody cared about and whatever. It would be interesting to know, and I'm not sure who. I mean, is anybody at Cornell thinking about that? Where is the, in the old sprayed orchards, a really interesting thing would be, where, to dissect the apple trees and look for where the contaminants of lead arsenic are.
A heritage apple, the definition, I did hear you say you can go and somebody could see where the graft line was and that kind of thing. How do you define a heritage apple?
The answer to the first question is, how do you define heirloom? And there is no definition of heirloom really that I think anybody agrees on.
Is heirloom and heritage the same thing?
Or heritage or whatever, yeah. So what my own personal definition, which I don't quibble with people about, but I just use it, is a selected apple. So the scientists would call it a cultivar, but most people just say variety, would be something that was grown. I used the year 1933, which was the last big, horrible test winter in Maine when thousands of trees died and many of the old orchards were succumbed, and the sort of modern apple industry was formed, which was around McIntosh and Cortland and so forth. But you could say 1900 or whatever. So they're like, I think probably a reasonable definition would be an old, long-grown favorite homestead apple or something like that. And whatever any definition is probably okay. As far as the seedlings at your place or, all over Maine, there are hundreds of thousands of seedling apples in the state of Maine. And many of them are of exceptional quality for something, if you were at the other talk this morning, I'm not sure what they're talking about cider, but they're probably they are talking about at least somewhat about that subject, because especially as cider has become popular, the modern and most of the historic American apples were not selected for their fermented cider quality. They were selected to be eaten fresh, be dessert, or for cooking in some various form. So cider makers who are beyond the sort of initial learning how to make cider are going to want a wider palette. What many cider makers are looking for are exactly what you have in your woods. They're looking for interesting flavors, different sugar contents, tannins, bitterness, whatever. Fortunate or unfortunate thing about this is that as you get into it and attempt to focus, it becomes broader and broader and broader, whether you want it to or not. So we, Cammie and I, and many of the people who are sitting right here and many of the people at the weekend are spending a lot of time looking for those apples of yours. So yes, those apples that you have, if they taste good, it's like Duke Ellington said about jazz, right? If it sounds good, it is good. Well, the same is true with an apple. If it tastes good, it is good. The first thing that we do, whether it's a seedling or whether it's an old grafted tree that we're learning about, the first thing we do is we cook with it. I think if you could take the heirloom, historic, whatever heritage apples, you took, 500 of them, varieties, and started to learn about them, you'd find that the majority of those were never eaten fresh. They were eaten cooked. And so what I say to people is, try eating a raw potato. And so, a lot of people will say to me, and especially when I was first getting into this, I knew I had no friends that were doing this, so I would go to the commercial orchard meetings in Maine, And and there's all these like old men and me, young guy, and they're like talking to themselves. They're saying, "Oh, those old heirloom apples, they're terrible. You should cut them all down. They're no good." And I was thinking, this doesn't make sense. These were brilliant people. Why were they growing apples that were no good? And then one day it like dawned on me, like, oh, why don't I try to make a pie? And so I got a friend who's a really good chef to give me like the most basic, simple, unadorned pie recipe. I made a pie with some apples that tasted terrible, and the pie was fantastic. And I thought, okay, now I'm beginning to get it, and now we make either sauce or pies or something with every apple that we can. And we find like, oh my God, this apple that we thought wasn't any good, this is becoming our favorite apple. But can you eat it fresh? No. But how many apples can you eat fresh? Try eating 10 apples a day for a week fresh, and then don't come see me, But you can eat like, you probably eat a quart of applesauce a day, or at least a half a quart. And then of course you get into cider but so yes, those seedlings that you see by the side of the road or in your woods or whatever, what differentiates us from them is that back then before 1900, instead of having like land grant colleges like Penn State or University of Massachusetts or Cornell or whatever doing the breeding, it was like everybody was the breeder. And they were out there selecting, the best beans, the best squash, the best corn, the best apples, the best, all that stuff. It was all going on the farm. Every seedling that came up on your farm was a potential for something that either they would grow and propagate on their own farm, or eventually they became the next. Well, that was how Macintosh got started. It was just a wild seedling on somebody's farm. And they tasted it, they thought, hey, this is pretty good. And one thing led to another, and by 100 years later, it was the most popular apple in New York and New England.
If every apple tree's seeds are as varied as the couplings of a human, you saw it's like, if that's true, isn't it possible that among all the varieties of seeds, there'd be some of the old ones too? The genetics must still be in the trees.
The seeds will be similar, but I have friends who have 15 brothers and sisters. They're all similar, but they're still all unique.
You're not going to get the real wide range of diversity in the seeds. Some will be bigger, some small, whatever, but it's not going to go to a yellow apple.
Oh, it might. I mean, well, you start to learn the genetics, and then you start to see the variation possibilities. But of course, over the span of like your land or the land of anybody else here who has seedlings, there's going to be pretty wide diversity.
Somewhere in the state, those heritage apples might be growing on a tree that was never even grafted, but to find them, of course, that's been your life's work.
Well, and also there are very old seedlings. So there are apples from seed that were never grafted in this state that are well over 100 years old. So are those heirloom apples? Well, I don't know. Some of them we like so much, we have grafted and put them in the Heritage Orchard. So I think that when you establish your collection, wherever you are, you get to decide, what do we include?
The thing about the heritage that make them special, that somebody in the past selected it.
Yes, that's certainly part of it.
It was enjoyed, and there was a reason it had.
Yeah, it has a story.
And those are the heritage apples you're looking for.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But we're a non-discriminatory explorer. Yeah.
How do you feel going forward with climate change that your preservation of these apples might not see the need to move north?
So one of my friends is the retired director of the Arnold Arboretum, and some of you know about the Arnold, and he's like, very knowledgeable. And what he says is there are no climate deniers in the plant community. That's unknown in plants. So they are they're right now figuring out how to deal with this mess we're in. They're like on it, and as a result of what what's happening, some plants won't grow here anymore. Some plants that don't grow here now will grow here, and some selections will grow here. And I'm not sure if I'm going to try to answer your question. As far as we'll use the term historic. As far as the historic varieties of apples, they do have obviously a unique genetic profile. Some of them have been through a lot already because some of these varieties date back to well before 1600 or older. And some of the varieties that were selected in the U.S., their genetics go back, well, of course, they all go way back, but some go back pretty quickly back into Europe and so forth. I think that nobody knows, but I think that in what we are preserving do potentially exist genetics that could be useful as we move forward into the upcoming decades. I think that Craig was talking about the seedlings in his forest, that increasingly we are going to be wanting to look to the apples. Now we'll just talk apples, the apples themselves to sort of lead the way into the future. And I think that we're going to lose some of our favorite historic apples. And that's sad. I think of legacy, and legacy is like the future. Legacy is not about the messenger, it's about the message. My mentors are gone. Someday I'm going to be gone. No one's going to remember our names when you go beyond a certain point. But the message is what we want. It's the torch, and the torch in this case is the the beauty of the plant and what the plant does for us. And we have to ultimately let go of Northern Spy and Golden Russet and all the rest, because at some point they will be gone. But what we can hope is that appleness, if you want to call it that, will continue. And what we want to do now is make sure that if there are precious genetics, valuable genetics in what was here, we want them to be here producing children that may be the future, so that in 100 years, some version of us will be sitting here and we'll be talking about the wonderful apples that we get to have. So, yeah.
Try eating a raw potato. Dang, that is classic John Bunker. It just gives you so much to contemplate here in this Q&A that brought us even deeper into the topic. And I love how probably a lot of these questions here are things that maybe you've been thinking about, but you're thinking, can I ask that question? Especially around the heritage versus heirloom. There's some political things around that, why we don't want to call stuff heritage anymore, because what does that really mean in a country that's been colonized? So more often than not, we hear heirloom. But the Heritage Orchard up in Maine, that was like 10 years plus ago. And at that time, there wasn't that consciousness of words and the power of them at that level. So we are constantly evolving the study, the relationship to humans, and the preservation of both ourselves and this beautiful fruit and all the surrounding fruits too. I love the reference basically to palms in art, how this woman in Italy is looking at artwork, the frescoes, and being able to document or go into the documents from a estate back then where the fruit was used for that painting, and they could look up what was that pear, what was that quince, what was that apple. They picked these fruits that were going to be able to stay on a table for a week to get painted so they wouldn't rot necessarily. If the pear is rotting, it's bleeding from the inside out. So that was really cool to hear that that's going on. And of course, the legacy. The legacy is about future. A lot here. I hope you really enjoyed it as much as I did in editing and producing it for you this week. There's going to be more from John Bunker from the Maine Apple Camp coming up next week. He'll be on the panel discussion. You do not want to miss that. If you have not yet subscribed to Cider Chat, please do. I don't want you missing it, because if you've listened this far, I know that you, like all of us out there in Ciderville, not only have a strong affection for cider, but also for orchards and the role that they have played throughout history, present day, and the role that they will continue to play in the future. That there is legacy all the way. Well done, John. Thank you, as always. Well, I'm about ready to roll out of here. I've lost my power once again due to a big snowstorm here on the East Coast. We haven't had any snow all winter, and now we just got slammed, and the power came on. Got a little of this podcast done, then power went off, and I am doing this in that kind of like on-the-go remote way. So you might have noticed a little bit of the audio change there, but all is good in Ciderville because somehow we do have the technology. I'm going to have to head out next to the library to be able to upload where they do still have power so I could get this live for you this week. So with that, I leave you here. This is Real Wind Caller signing off for now. Looking forward to seeing you in Ciderville.
We like cider, we like palms, we love orchards and having fun. There is a reason why we do it like this. Oh yes there is. There is a reason why we do it like this. Oh yes there is. There is a reason why we drink it like this. Oh yes there is a reason. We like walking through the orchards, dancing in the streets, smelling all the blossoms, kicking up our feet. We like cider, we like palms, we like orchards, having some fun. There is a reason why we do it like this. Oh yes there is. There is a reason why we do it like this. Oh yes there is. There is a reason why we drink it like this. Oh yes there is. There is a reason. We like walking through the orchards, dancing in the streets, smelling all the blossoms, kicking up our feet. Oh yeah. We like cider. Oh yes we do. We like palms. Oh yes we do. We love orchards, having some fun. There is a reason why we do it like this. Ba-da-da-dum. There is a reason why we do it like this. Ba-da-da-dum. There is a reason why we drink it like this. Ba-da-da-dum. Ba-da-da-dum. We like walking down the orchards, dancing in the streets, smelling all the blossoms, kicking up our feet. Oh yeah. We like cider. Ba-da-da-dum. We like palms. Oh yes we do. We like orchards, having some fun. Yeehaw!